As in many of the esoteric systems and paradigms which we have and will examine on this channel, Gnosticism as a broad concept comes with its own variety of symbolic, mythical, and magical images. We'll begin part 2 of this series on Gnosticism by examining a few of these images and attempting to parse them both historically and symbolically. I'm Ike Baker, and this is Arcanum. Among the most widely known is the Gnostic Abraxas. Abraxas is a singularly mystifying figure within Gnostic philosophy and cosmogony from our current-day retrospective view. Descriptions of Abraxas alternate from a god to a demiurge to demon, depending upon the source. The meaning and etymology of the name is highly disputed, and much of what we understand of Abraxas comes from reports of the Basilidian Gnostic school of thought, which we covered in part 1 of this series. We are informed by such sources as Irenaeus and Epiphanius that the Basilidians worshipped Abraxas as a transcendent god. However, while Irenaeus elaborates Abraxas in the Basilidian conception as the unborn father, in Epiphanius' testimony, Abraxas is considered the highest archon and not synonymous with the greatest or highest god. One of the earliest historical mentions of Abraxas comes to us from within the Nag Hammadi codices, which betrays more of a Sethian lineage. The Holy Book of the Great Invisible Spirit, or the Gospel of the Egyptians. In this text, the name is rendered Abraxas. Here we read Abraxas, or Abraxas, as given the following appellations or titles. Abraxas is also referred to as one of the, quote, 4 great lights. In this context, Abraxas is expressed as being a particular species of Aeon, more especially one of the spiritual lights. What is interesting about the name Abraxas or Abraxas is that the isopsephic value of the name totals to 365, which are the numbers of heavens in the Basilidian cosmogony. This, along with certain other descriptions of Abraxas, leads us toward an abstract picture of the entity as perhaps the underlying force, both encapsulating and providing substantive ground for the created universe. We can attempt to extract some idea of the nature of Abraxas by studying some of its symbolism. A singularly enigmatic figure, the Gnostic Abraxas occurs repeatedly on amulets known as Abraxas stones, as a composite entity depicted as having the head of a rooster, the upper body of a man, and 2 serpents for legs. The figure typically wields a scourge or whip and a shield. In interpretation, some cultural nuance of the time period may avail us here. It is commonly noted, most famously perhaps in Aesop's fables, that the Greeks believed the rooster to be the only animal that could inspire fear in a lion. This, combined with the almost lion-tamer-esque whip and shield, might suggest a few speculations. Of particular interest here is the solar imagery, the rooster being a bird known to herald the rising sun, but also in dominating the lion, whose symbolism is closely allied to the solar body. This might suggest itself as commanding or dominating the sun or solar forces, intimating a kind of god above god or sun behind the sun. Anyone who has actually physically encountered a rooster will be aware of its fierce and aggressive tendencies. This is interesting as Abraxas' human aspect seems not only to be armed with a scourge and shield, but also often to be donning the body plate armor and war skirt or kilt of a soldier or gladiator. The dual serpentine lower body is expressive of a sublunary, earthbound nature. In reviewing the composite scheme of this figure, we see that it fully embodies the celestial or supra-celestial realms, the lower or earthly realms, and the human realm, as the mediator and marriage of both in and by the human form. Another important entity of particularly symbolic prominence in the historical record is the demiurge as referred to, Ialdabaoth. Again, this is a name which we can only guess at etymologically at the present moment. Suffice it to note that the root of the name appears to at least have some relation to the Aeon-Byte, whose name also appears on the Abraxas amulets. Various forms of this name, as well as that of Abraxas, are also present within the PGM, or Greek magical papyri. Ialdabaoth, the product or son of Sophia's fall, or attempt to copy the emanative powers of the Absolute, divorced from the masculine counterpart of her syzygy pair, is referred to in various Gnostic texts, including the Apocryphon or secret book of John, and the hypostases of the archons, or the realities of the rulers, as being an ignorant creator god, who either denies or is completely unaware of any higher god or creative agency than itself. Again, we find in depictions of Ialdabaoth on Gnostic amulets an animal associated with the sun, the lion, with its lower half being comprised once more of a serpentine body. This represents depictions of the Greek god Ion, Eon, which alternately translates as age, epoch, and has a general connotation of an enormously long period of time. Yet another symbol identified with early Christian Gnostics is the Ouroboros, meaning tail-eating. A familiar symbol throughout occult and religious symbolism, we are yet again confronted with the serpentine imagery, as well as time and materiality. This symbol was adopted by Gnostics, rather than appearing out of the Greco-Egyptian syncretism occurring in and around Alexandria during the last few centuries BCE and the first few centuries CE. One of the earliest depictions of it being in the tomb of King Tutankhamun, dating back to the 14th century BCE. It has even been found on ancient Chinese pottery, dating further back to a civilization there of the Neolithic period, placing it somewhere between 5,000 to 3,000 years BCE. Origin described the Ouroboros as appearing in the symbolism of Gnostic schools of thought to denote, quote, eternity and the soul of the world. The Gnostic text Pistis Sophia described the Ouroboros as a 12-sectioned serpent enclosing the cosmos with its tail in its mouth. A 3rd century Alexandrian Hermetic series of alchemical diagrams entitled the Chrysopoeia of Cleopatra presents an image of the Ouroboros encircling the Greek words entopan, or all is one. Arriving once again at Alexandria, let's take this opportunity to examine the cultural context within which Gnosticism was birthed, the philosophical and cultural soil from which it grew and within which it flourished. The very beginnings of Gnosticism are debated among scholars. In general, there are two major theoretical distinctions, the first being that Gnosticism evolved as a pre-Christian, perhaps Jewish heresy of sorts, a product of the Hellenization of Judaism of the last few centuries BCE and first few centuries CE, and eventually became enmeshed with another Jewish heresy, Christianity. The other distinction being that Gnosticism itself came from within early Christianity, as a sect within the larger community. Whatever the argument, Christianity is typically tied to Gnosticism in one form or another, as we conceive of it today. As the French scholar Simon Petremont points out, quote, whatever the strangeness of some of the Gnostic writings, Pauline thought and Johannine thought are always to be found at their roots, end quote. However, some point to Simon Magus, a Samarian, as a first or proto-Gnostic teacher. Aspects of what has been called the Simonian myth very closely resemble Gnostic cosmology and philosophy, with a division of a unified absolute into male-female pair, the descent and exile of the feminine, who serves as a mother to the generators of the material cosmos, while simultaneously being imprisoned or entrapped in this realm of spiritual degradation, and the ensuing extraction of that female principle and her restoration to former glory by a figure thought to be either the transcendent God or some embodied aspect of the transcendent God. There is, however, further evidence that some early form of Gnosticism may have existed within the early Platonic schools. Ultimately, it is difficult to pinpoint an exact period of genesis for this movement, because many of the categories and attributes of the philosophies which we consider to be quote-unquote Gnostic have many variations and important differences. Therefore, it becomes difficult at some points to say what exactly does or doesn't qualify as Gnostic. However, we may say that the locations of modern-day Israel, Palestine, and the Near East were major sites for the earliest forms of Gnosticism. Alexandria, Egypt in particular, is a very good place to begin parsing the evolution of Gnostic thought as it comes to us in the present day. While the oldest extant Gnostic text we have today dates to around the 2nd century CE, we know from the testimony of the heresiologist and the early church father Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyon, France, that by at least 180 CE, the Gnostic movement had gained enough traction as a Christian school of thought to be worthy at least of writing a polemic treatise about. So really, we're looking at the 1st and 2nd century CE for any historically discernible Gnostic school of thought being present within the overarching Christian community of those Eastern Mediterranean areas. Again, we trace Gnosticism and Christianity itself to Alexandria, Egypt in 42 BCE, when according to tradition, St. Marcus brings Christianity to Egypt at Alexandria, the city where East meets West. Further, as noted in the previous episode, it is curious that all surviving Gnostic texts come to us through history in Coptic translation. What's most interesting about this fact is that the Gnostic cosmogony and cosmology was contemporaneous to and derivative of both the Neoplatonic and Hermetic traditions which flourished in this area, particularly in Alexandria. For the generative source of the underlying prevailing worldview of the traditions of this place and time, we turn once again to, say it with me, Plato. In particular, there are two works which we have covered in detail in various episodes, which delineate to a large extent the cosmological traditions of all later Western philosophical systems, ultimately converging in Hellenized Egypt and culminating in the Christ event. These are the Myth of in Book 10 of Plato's Republic and the dialogue Timaeus. A caveat here is that Plato's work and the work of the philosophers within the Middle and Late Platonist milieu is far too complex to boil down to merely two dialogues, and there are several other important works of Plato which elaborate and provide strong support for these ideas. However, the main points, for the sake of time, can be extrapolated from these two dialogues, and they should be somewhat familiar to us having looked at them in past episodes. In the Myth of an ancient soldier named Ur's tale of his own near-death experience, Socrates expounds and elaborates the transmigration of the soul after death, its journey outside the causal spheres of the mundane planets, its unification with a guiding spirit, the daimon, the punishment of those who had violated natural law by being cruel, intemperate, and unjust in previous lives, and the choosing of lives anew by those souls who qualified to travel forth again to the material spheres, as well as the quote-unquote clearing of the slate of memory in between lives and the binding or karmic, to use a well-known term, mechanism of creation. This tale of ascent beyond the heavenly spheres to a realm, the Ogdoad or 8th sphere, outside of causality, the physical universe, was the basis upon which the successive Ptolemaic model of the physical cosmos, the emanative divine creative hierarchies of Plotinus and Iamblichus, and the descent through the spheres and the donning of the astral garments expounded by Porphyry were based. This gave the schema of the hebdomad, or spheres of the archons, the inverse syzygies, the planetary influences. The Gnostic Hermetist and Egyptian scribe priest Zosimos of Panopolis, who transmitted the Hermetic alchemical teachings of Alexandrian Egypt in the 4th century CE, believed in the Porphyrian descent of the soul. Department head of Religious and Ethical Studies at Meredith College, Professor Shannon Grimes, writes in her book, Becoming Gold, that Zosimos of Panopolis believed, quote, "The planets impart both virtues and vices to the soul as it makes its descent through the cosmos, to be born on earth," end quote. The basic tenets of Hermetism as propounded by the corpus of texts attributed to the Greco-Egyptian synthesis of the Egyptian god Thoth and the Greek god Hermes in Thoth Hermes Trismegistus contain much of the same terminology, cosmology, and philosophy as the core of Neoplatonism. This is due to the fact that it was all derivative of the Platonic corpus, the dialogues of Plato, and interspersed with Egyptian cosmogony and mythology, which, according to many antique Greek attestations, Plato would have been initiated in. Zosimos also relates a tale reminiscent of Hebrew and Gnostic thought, wherein, according to the now-lost work of Hermes Trismegistus called the Physica, a group of fallen angels descended to earth to have sexual relations with human women, and after doing so, teach them many arts. Chief among them for Zosimos is the art of alchemy, the Hermetic art. This is highly reminiscent to works in the Hebrew corpus, such as the Book of Enoch, the Watchers, and there are some similarities to the hypostases of the archons, as well as the Apocryphon of John. In the Timaeus, Plato expounds his cosmogony and the nature of the creative agent of this cosmos by way of a lengthy exhortation by the titular character, Timaeus, which he is careful to delineate as the Pythagorean philosopher. Timaeus speaks at length about the chief creative entity of the cosmos, which he calls, and essentially coining the term, at least according to historical record, the Demiurge. In Timaeus' conception, the Demiurge is not malevolent, but good, using forms of the ideal realm to construct physical reality. Namely, the revolutions or orbits of the planets and the logistikon, the rational patterns which generate and maintain the physical universe, and which are the purview of natural philosophy, in things such as geometry and physics. The Demiurge then utilizes the help of lesser gods and beings to assist him in the creation and maintenance of the cosmos. These are the archons, or rulers. According to Regius Professor of Greek at Trinity College, Professor John M. Dillon, quote, Gnosticism imported its concept of the ideal realm, or pleroma, from Plato's concept of the cosmos and demiurge in Timaeus, and of Philo's noetic cosmos, in contrast to the aesthetic cosmos. End quote. In the Gorgias, Plato makes a case utilizing wordplay, soma, meaning body, and sema, meaning prison, to indicate that the body is the prison of the soul. In these and many other of Plato's works, we find an ontology and cosmology which leads us ultimately to theurgy, with the Neoplatonists, who existed contemporaneously and in the same areas as the Gnostic schools of thought in Alexandria, the Mediterranean, and the Near East. Now, we're going to cover theurgy in depth in future episodes, but for now we'll discuss it as it relates to Gnosticism and the Gnostic worldview. Taking all of the aforementioned doctrines and ideas of Plato, carrying them forth through time as the prevailing or dominant philosophical, cosmological paradigm within which nearly all other scholars, academics, priests, and philosophers of that time and place deigned themselves to be working, we come to a fairly delineated picture of the cosmos as created by an entity called the Demiurge, who is not the ultimate or absolute God, because the forms which he uses to create pre-exist him, who also employs the help of lesser gods to rule and govern his creation with him. That the material sphere is a realm beyond which the soul can naturally traverse, yet comes into incarnation in a body by emotion, desire, and folly, and does so repeatedly. This is called metempsychosis, essentially a Greek word for reincarnation. In the traversing of the planetary spheres to and from the Ogdoad, the eighth sphere beyond the causal realms of the cosmos, the soul either takes on in entering or casts off in departing various characteristics, vices and virtues, dispositions imparted to it by the planetary spheres, the syzygies of the archons, and their placement during the descent of the soul in the case of incarnation. That while here, the soul is trapped within the confines of the body and lured into a state of illusion and somnambulance via the material senses and the various allurements of the physical world, which generate fierce impulses, attachments. Neoplatonic philosophy, or late Platonism, argued by most scholars to have begun with the works of the Egyptian-born Hellenistic philosopher Plotinus, or Plotinus really, eventually culminated in a form of ceremonial ritual called theurgy. This was first expounded, according to historical records, by Porphyry on a philosophical level, but later developed fully by his student, the Syrian Neoplatonist Iamblichus. This operative evolution of Neoplatonism was an attempt at ascent, or perhaps temporary escape, from temporality itself. through the causal spheres to the space beyond the material cosmos, which in Gnostic cosmology would have been equated, at least in some sense, to the pleroma. The extant text, which delineates the underlying philosophy of theurgy while not necessarily divulging much of the operative techniques, comes to us in the form of a pseudonymously attributed response from the Egyptian priest Anebo to certain assertions or questions posited by the philosopher Porphyry, entitled in translation as On the Mysteries. Scholars attribute the true authorship of this text to Iamblichus, and it is the central extant work on Neoplatonic theurgy. We'll cover these topics in a further series on Neoplatonism. For now, it serves to point out the parallel between the underlying theurgic cosmology and ascent and Gnosticism, as they share this underlying cosmology and philosophy, and there is evidence that the Gnostics had their own rites of ascent. We see suggestions of this can even be found in the New Testament epistles of St. Paul to the Corinthian Christian communities, where he mentions a Christian brother who was, quote, caught up to the third heaven. The writings of Plotinus, collated in a collection of documents entitled the Enneads, expound a similar worldview and philosophy. These writings, and the philosophy they contain or express, have been tremendously influential to later developments in Platonic thought. In certain respects, sharing a common underlying cosmological worldview, Platonian philosophy, espousing an emanative theology as found in the Gnostic and later Kabbalistic schools, also regards the material cosmos as a kind of nether realm, distant from its divine source and ruled by quasi-hostile or at least ignorant entities. Though Plotinus himself wrote a treatise entitled Against the Gnostics, modern scholars over the course of 2 conferences have discovered there to be a group within the Platonic school pre-existent to Christianity, also referring to themselves as Gnostics. However, several of the ideas which Plotinus addresses in this refutation are consonant with what we understand of later Gnostic beliefs. Plotinus' teacher was Ammonius Saccas. Not much is known of this highly influential instructor and philosopher, but some scholars and researchers have pointed out 2 things of potential significance. That Ammonius Saccas was an epithet more than a proper name, denoting the title of Saccas to be a loan word of slight corruption. The title Sakyas, or Scythian, similar to the epithet given to the Buddha of India, Sakya Muni, Ammonius Saccas, meaning the Scythian teacher. Ammonius Saccas being an inversion of this, meaning essentially the same thing. This is unsubstantiated by scholarship and can be a hard pill for an academic to swallow. But before you go nervously reaching for those Windsor knots, let's look at some of the more accepted evidence among the larger academic communities. Don't get your tweeds in a twist. According to Porphyry in his biography of Plotinus, after finding the teacher he had been searching for in Ammonius Saccas, quote, he stayed continually with Ammonius and acquired so complete a training in philosophy that he became eager to make acquaintance with the Persian philosophical discipline and that prevailing among the Indians, end quote. Much of Plotinus' philosophy is admitted widely to be extremely similar to several Vedantic and Buddhist philosophies at its core, to such an extent that there is a niche of peer-reviewed articles, essays, and books on the subject regarding a possible connection. This leads us to a discussion about the connection between Gnostic philosophy and the Eastern traditions. At their core, Gnostic philosophy and the religions and philosophical teachings of the East have many similarities. For instance, the relation of the words gnosis and jnana being cognates, both terms for spiritual knowledge. Gnosticism and Hinduism agree on the idea of a divine presence within the individual. The Vedas of Hinduism called this Atman, while the Gnostic and Neoplatonists would have called this perhaps the Pneuma. There are also many similarities between Gnosticism and Buddhism as well. First and foremost, perhaps the idea that life is suffering, and again an ascent or escape from embodied existence and the cycle of reincarnation, or metempsychosis to the Neoplatonists and Gnostics, by way of detachment from desire or physical impulse. Now let's take a moment to have a look at some more modern iterations of Gnosticism. While not technically contemporaneous to our times, the Cathars were believed to have been a sort of neo-Gnostic sect taking hold in the southern regions of France in the 12th and 13th centuries. There is some identification throughout history of the Cathars with the Manichaeans, which some have speculated was a product of the Gnostic Balkan missionaries of the Bogomils and their venturing into the area to evangelize. But this is speculation. What we know of the Cathars is that in 1172, Cathar initiates, or perfecti, convened in the small French town of Saint-Felice-de-Caraman near Toulouse, under the auspices of a Bogomil bishop named Nicetas. It was there that they held a council on the reorganization of the existing movement and efforts to spread and promote their doctrines. The town of Albi was also known to be a Cathar bastion, and the Cathars were also referred to as Albigensians. By the massive population residing in the Languedoc in southern France with the Cathars, they were referred to as the good men and good women. Their supreme rite of elevation or perfection was called the consolamentum, and was offered to both men and women. This sacrament assured the recipient of final liberation from what they considered to be the realm of the evil or fallen angel Lucifer, a kind of sublunary hellscape. They agreed with the Gnostics of earlier times that the soul of a human was spiritual, even angelic in nature, but that those souls were trapped in corrupt and corrupting human forms. The architect of this scheme, however, in their medieval Christian milieu was Lucifer rather than the Demiurge. The initiated perfecti lived lives of discipline, restriction, piety, and renunciation, considering the material as eminently dangerous to the spiritual nature of the indwelling soul. Therefore, they eschewed all attachment to earthly things. In 1179, Pope Alexander III declared the Cathars sect anathema, and effectively declared open season on the growing group of ascetics. In 1208, Pope Innocent III instituted the Holy Inquisition, specifically toward the end of exterminating the Cathars. The Cathars, however, were not obliged to defend themselves by violence, being pacifists, in accordance with their religious disciplines of doing only those things which help and never hurt another person. Catholics of the region, however, often came to their aid, giving their lives at times in order to save the good men and women. 1209 saw the effective beginning of what would become known as the Albigensian Crusades, which lasted until about 1249 or 1250. From 1243 to 1244, the castle of Montségur, a sacred site to the Cathars, was laid siege by crusaders. After the final fall of the castle, hundreds of Cathars were marched to a field and burned en masse. It is reported that during their burning, the Cathars mounted to the flames singing hymns. To this day, this place is called the Field of the Burnt Ones. It is rumored that the faith continued on in parts of Italy and perhaps other parts of Europe, with some claiming as recently as the last century to be Cathars, though in open secrecy. Another French quasi-heresy was that of Martine de Pasquale and his Ordre des Chevaliers Masons Éloquents de l'Univers, or the Order of Knight Masons Elect Priests of the Universe, Éloquents for short. In brief, Pasquale was somebody who left behind very little regarding early formative years and life details. However, a large selection of his letters and writings have been preserved. Pasquale's writings were collected posthumously by his students, among them the unknown philosopher Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin and Jean-Baptiste Villermoz, and compiled into a work now entitled The Treatise on the Reintegration of Beings, for short. In this treatise, the 18th century works of Pasquale delineate a Gnostic cosmogony and cosmology similar to earlier forms of Gnosticism centuries earlier, intimately tied to the biblical stories of Genesis, particularly of the creation of the universe and of Adam. This also espoused an emanative cosmogony and hierarchy stemming from an absolute unity. Keep in mind now that a lot of the Nag Hammadi or Gnostic codices would not have been available to Pasquale, unless perhaps they resided in a private collection somewhere. However, he may have been influenced by the Cathar faith, being in France. According to the Treatise on the Reintegration of Beings, Adam was initially created as a sort of cosmic prison guard or overseer of the terrestrial realm of the universe, which was created to sequester what Pasquale referred to as the first, quote, prevaricating spirits. Adam's job was to watch over and assist in the reconciliation of this group of spiritual rebels. However, he was lured into becoming fragmented and enslaved himself, no longer of a divine or high position. but subjected by material body and senses to enslavement to the physical. Adam, in absconding this high estate, is now trapped in this cycle, being ruled over by the various regents of the chief prevaricator, Lucifer. The goal of the Elu Kohen is to exorcise these demonic entities, and by a unique application of Christian theurgy to help re-elevate humankind to its initial estate as regents over and not subjects of the material illusory realm. However, it did espouse a method of inner perfection through grace and with the assistance of the Christ. We'll be covering Pasquale and the Elu Kohens in detail in further episodes. Of the ancient Gnostic faiths, the Mandaean sect, also known as the Sabians, is still prominent as a modern-day religion. While there are various Gnostic churches of Manichaeans, primarily in China, and Valentinian Gnostic groups scattered throughout Europe and the United States, Mandaean Gnostics have a well-preserved line of transmission and a large enough presence as a distinct community to be considered not as a reconstructed or re-emerged religious sect, but rather as a continuously living tradition and closed ethno-religious group. Originally, these peoples were speakers of the Mandaic language, an Eastern Aramaic language. However, the language is not spoken en masse after large numbers of conversion to Arabic and Farsi. It is now a scriptural or liturgical language. Manda, in the Mandaic language, means possessing knowledge. The Mandaeans believe Adam to have been progenitor of their faith and believe John the Baptist to be their final and most significant prophet. They believe that the material world was fashioned from the materials of light and darkness and created by a demiurgic figure called Ptahil, etymologically similar to the early ancient Egyptian creator god Ptah. Ptahil accomplishes this with the assistance of dark powers, namely the Seven, the 12, and Ruha, queen of the underworld. Mandaeans call the indwelling divine principle, the soul, Adam Kasya, the hidden Adam. It is through repeated ritual cleansing, taking the form of baptisms, that the soul, or hidden Adam, can reascend from the realm of dense dark materiality to the hinterlands, which is its home and origin, the realm of divine light. There is no emphasis on an historical Christ figure in Mandaism. They believe themselves, according to their scripture, to be the direct descendants of the biblical patriarch Noah's son Shem, as well as spiritual descendants of John the Baptist's Nazarene disciples. Carl Jung is another name often found amid modern Gnostic currents, as well as other streams of thought associated with the occult, such as alchemy. His work has been significant in elucidating the psychological or psychoanalytic aspects of these traditions, which before his time had no modern scientific vernacular with which to be elucidated. However, Jung's work has done much to psychologize these subjects to a mainstream audience. The downside to utilizing modern scientific vernacular to elaborate something is that we inevitably place it within that particular paradigm, and therefore can only effectively examine it through such a lens, using those words, concepts, and systems. However, it is my personal belief, upon the collection and publishing of Jung's personal journals, which contain his visionary experiences, and observing how deeply he penetrated into these esoteric topics from a 19th century academic milieu, that Jung was indeed an esotericist, a mystic in his interior. Early in his academic career, Jung wrote a text called 7 Sermons to the Dead, which he pseudonymously attributed to Basilides. There has been some mention that he privately claimed it to be a channeled communication with Basilides. Jung was forced to essentially apologize for the work within academia, and write it off as an early youthful speculation and academic sloppiness. It was revealed upon the publishing of one such visionary journal's The Red Book that 7 sermons comprised the last few pages of that collected work. However, he rarely submitted work on esoteric topics outside of the academic psychological interpretation after this backlash, and we might speculate perhaps because of it. A central figure in modern or neo-Gnosticism is the scholar and neo-Gnostic bishop Stephan Hoeller. Hoeller's work has included seminal academic literary works on Gnosticism, Kabbalah, and Carl Jung, particularly Jung's mystical and esoteric leanings. He also formed the Ecclesia Gnostica, an open sacramental neo-Gnostic church based in Los Angeles. He gives lectures and homilies on Gnosticism and related topics through the Ecclesia Gnostica webpage. His book, Gnosticism, A New Light on the Ancient Tradition of Inner Knowing, was the first book on Gnosticism I read, and I recommend it be the first anyone who's looking into these subjects read. Gnosticism as a philosophy or ideology of interest in the present day is burgeoning, and to the degree that it can, rising to prominence in the peripheries of the mainstream awareness by way of authors such as Hoeller, Richard Smalley, David Braca, Eric Davis, and others. Currently, one of my favorite outlets for reliable, entertaining content concerning Gnosticism and related topics is Aeon-Byte Gnostic Radio, produced and hosted by modern Gnostic Miguel Conner. I highly recommend his work and channel for anyone interested in any and all things Gnostic. Again, a link is provided in the section below this video. Among other more academic commentators, authors in the vein of science fiction have also touched upon Gnosis and Gnosticism, most notably perhaps Philip K. Dick, whose works have been made into some of the most influential sci-fi films of the last few decades, including Blade Runner, Minority Report, A Scanner Darkly, and Total Recall. Through the course of his work, from the Valis trilogy to the exegesis of Philip K. Dick, he expounds a distinctly neo-Gnostic cosmology. Here now is a very important word about the way I've been using the terms Gnostic and Gnosticism. From our modern perspective, and advantages concerning the retrospective examination of information, even in as early in the modern period as the mid to late 1800s, much of what is available can be cherry-picked. Some of that is of necessity, and some of it is for the sake of what I call esoteric treasure hunting. Many of these ideas are of an arcane or hidden nature and therefore dwell in the common intellectual outer darkness. These ideas can be very attractive to those whose underlying motives serve a kind of interior rebellion against everything. Oftentimes, this is a starting point for great work, but it is just as often, and sometimes simultaneously, a state of arrested development within a countercultural milieu. Gnosticism has always been countercultural, and its adherents have always claimed a secret knowledge, which was sometimes referred to as gnosis. However, there has also always been a working within a religious, typically Judeo-Christian framework, as far as we can tell, along with a particular lifestyle, which the philosophy necessitates. For instance, we see admonitions against materiality in all extant forms of Gnostic thought from antiquity. We also see a tendency toward morality as the expediting or deliverance of the soul from the realms of materiality. So we can say that Gnosticism is not mere philosophy, nor even ritual. It's a way of being in the world, a way of life. Gnosticism as a term is not really appropriately applied to modern schools of thought or things. It's again one of those overused and little understood, misappropriated words whose meaning differs widely, typically depending on who's using it. We tend to label or call things Gnostic, kind of a catch-all phrase to describe things as having a vaguely particular, perhaps punk rock ethos or attribute. An affinity with things countercultural, cynical, quasi-mystical, or esoteric, particularly in, let's say, an underdog versus the establishment motif. But attempting to meet the earliest Gnostics on their own terms, whether they be the early Judeo-Christian sects or Platonic schools of thought, we can find a philosophically and theologically motivated lifestyle to be a common denominator within those communities, a lifestyle committed to transcendence of the earthly material inclination and the wisdom of this world. They shared an underlying worldview which is no longer extant, except in its reawakening in the spheres of occult speculation and interest in esoterica, and perhaps as an academic cul-de-sac. In short, in my estimation, while it can be helpful for context, it is not viable to seriously attribute as Gnostic anything outside of the scope of the religious Gnosticism of late antiquity, which we still find in the Mandaeans and some small Manichaean groups in the present day. In 1913, Edward Alexander, better known by his self-styled moniker Aleister Crowley, wrote a quote-unquote Gnostic Mass for the Ecclesia Gnostica Catholica, a quasi-religious esoteric organization birthed out of the Ordo Templi Orientis, the OTO. Crowley described the Mass as the central ritual, public and private, of the OTO. However, the Mass seems more a vehicle for delivering Crowley's own principles by way of the religion he created, Thelema. However, nothing within the Mass, save for its resemblance to the Mass of the Eastern Orthodox churches, contains anything traditionally or theologically inherently Gnostic, except perhaps a portion of the anthem sung after consecration of the Eucharist. Another modern figure associated with Gnosticism is the late Victor Manuel Gómez Rodriguez, better known once again by a self-styled name, Samael Aun Weor. Gómez Rodriguez, a prolific author, taught a brand of New Age spiritual awakening, which he called universal Gnosticism. While the ultimate goal of this teaching is the Christification or liberation of the individual, we see a break with something traditionally Gnostic in his incorporation of New Age philosophy throughout the teachings. There are many elements of New Age, theosophical, and occult philosophy which make his brand of Gnosticism somewhat un-Gnostic. This is not necessarily to say anything about the intent or efficacy of his system, but rather that he worked outside of a traditionally Gnostic milieu. These criticisms of popular Gnostic modern movements does not rule out the possibility of gnosis itself, as it is a vague term implying spiritual or secret knowledge. However, how much of it can be ascribed to Gnosticism within the context of which we understand it from the perspective of the Gnostics of late antiquity, we can at no point be certain. Therefore, the modern quasi-pseudo-Gnostic distinction is not arbitrary. What many of these strands of modern Gnosticism have in common is, believe it or not, John Dee. Crowley was firstly an initiate of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and while it can be said he sort of missed the point, the Golden Dawn as a magical system, particularly at the inner order level, was essentially founded upon the Enochian scrying sessions of Dr. John Dee and Edward Kelly. Gómez Rodriguez was also heavily reliant upon systems which were ultimately culled from the Golden Dawn and its Hermetic Kabbalistic systems, which many practitioners and occult enthusiasts take for granted today, as if it were always the underlying backbone of esoteric thought and investigation. However, not so. Crowley even went so far as to perform a magical operation known as the scrying the ethers. We'll be covering all these in great detail in future episodes, but in brief, Dr. John Dee was an Elizabethan magus and scholar, among many other things, who did more for the magical arts in his lifetime than arguably any other figure since. He performed a series of visionary experiments, chiefly with a man named Edward Kelly, who was reported to be a very skilled seer. What ensued were angelic communication sessions lasting over a series of years and minutely recorded by Dr. Dee. Diagrams, tables, techniques, and an entire language as purportedly given to the Hebrew patriarch Enoch by an angel named Ave were communicated and utilized in the course of these sessions, which the founders of the Golden Dawn would later incorporate into a master key system of magic called Enochian, or Enochian if you like. One thing that stands out about these Enochian communications is the similarity between the nature of the imagery and messages received by Edward Kelly and certain Gnostic texts, only later available in the Nag Hammadi collection. Of particular interest is a tract called The Thunder Perfect Mind, which bears an uncanny resemblance at points to the angelic scribe material from an entity called the Daughter of Fortitude, which Kelly immediately identified as the Whore of Babylon of Revelation. I include part of these here for reference. Later, Crowley would encounter the same or at least similar entity, whom he would call Babylon, an inversion of the Virgin Mary and Sophia. While undergoing the scrying of the ethers, Crowley, as did Dee and Kelly, centuries prior, received communications of a distinctly eschatological nature, that is, concerning the end of the world, and the expediting of those events. Now, this is, if not from a literal macrocosmic point of view, then perhaps from the perspective of the individual, the microcosmic point of view, a very Gnostic idea. So, what are your thoughts on ancient versus modern, traditional versus neo-Gnosticism? Is pseudo-Gnosticism even a thing? Are you a butthurt Thelemite? Leave your thoughts in the comments section below. If you've enjoyed this content, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the Arcanum Patreon. For the cost of a cup of coffee per month, you can help me continue to produce free, rigorously researched, and practiced material like this. Patreon members also have access to bonus content, including episode addendums and my Egypt travel vlog, as well as other goodies. Please continue to watch, like, comment, and share if you're not in the position to contribute financially. There are always plenty of ways to help me keep the Arcanum channel alive and well. Join me again in the next episode where we'll dive deeper into the history, theory, and practice of this and many other related topics. Thanks for watching. In Luke's.